The words came out of her mouth so easily that at first, I thought I had misheard her. We were sitting in the living room, the same room where I had once rocked her to sleep when she was a baby, the same couch where she used to curl up beside me with her school books and ask for help. The afternoon light was soft, falling through the curtains, and everything felt ordinary. Too ordinary for what she was about to say. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't even look angry. She looked tired, annoyed, as if she were saying something inconvenient but necessary. She crossed her arms, avoided my eyes, and said, honestly, "The best gift you could give me would be if you just died." For a moment, the room went silent in a way I had never experienced before. Not quiet, empty, like the air itself had stepped back. I felt my chest tighten, not with pain, but with confusion. My mind tried to rearrange her words into something softer, something less final. I waited for her to laugh. I waited for her to say she was joking, that she didn't mean it, that she was just angry. She didn't. She picked up her phone instead. I sat there, my hands resting in my lap, feeling strangely calm on the outside, while something inside me cracked open slowly, carefully, like glass under pressure. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why. I didn't tell her how cruel that sounded. I just looked at her. She finally glanced up, irritated by my silence. "You know what I mean," she said. "You're always in the way, always controlling everything. If you were gone, things would finally be easier." Easier. That word stayed with me. I thought of the years I had spent making sure things were never easy for myself so they could be easier for her. The jobs I worked, the savings I guarded, the plans I made so she wouldn't have to worry. But I didn't say any of that. I nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging information, not absorbing a wound. "Okay," I said quietly. That seemed to annoy her more than any argument could have. She sighed loudly, stood up, and said, "Forget it. You're impossible." Then she walked out of the room. I stayed where I was. I didn't cry right away. I didn't feel angry. I felt something colder, something steadier, like a door closing very gently inside me. Later that night, after she had gone to her room and the house had settled into its usual silence, I sat alone at the dining table. The same table where I had paid bills, planned budgets, signed forms, and written checks. With her future in mind, I opened my laptop. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me. I logged into the account I rarely touched, the one connected to the trust fund, the tuition payments, the monthly support I had set up years ago, the one I had always thought of as untouchable, sacred. I stared at the numbers on the screen and thought about her words again. The best gift would be if you just died. I realized something then that took my breath away. She hadn't said it in anger. She had said it as a calculation. I closed the laptop without making any changes that night. I needed time, not to calm down, but to understand. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She made coffee, scrolled through her phone, complained about traffic. She asked if I had transferred the money for her upcoming expenses, her voice casual, almost bored. I looked at her and felt something shift again. "I haven't," I said. She frowned. "Why not?" I needed to think. She laughed, sharp and dismissive. "About what?" "It's already planned. You always do this." I didn't argue. "I'll let you know," I said. That was the moment her patience snapped. She put the cup down hard on the counter. "You can't just decide things on your own. That's my money." I met her eyes then. Calm, steady. "It's not," I said. Her expression changed. Not to fear, to disbelief. "Yes, it is," she replied. "You promised. You said I said I would support you." I interrupted softly. "I didn't say I would disappear." She stared at me, clearly confused by my tone. I wasn't angry. I wasn't pleading. I was finished. "You're being dramatic," she said. "Don't act like what I said yesterday was serious." I waited. She rolled her eyes. "I didn't mean it like that. You know how you are." That sentence hurt more than the first one. "You know how you are. As if cruelty were my misunderstanding." I picked up my keys and walked out of the house. I needed space. I needed to hear my own thoughts without her voice rewriting them. As I drove, memories came in waves, uninvited. Her first steps, her first day of school, the night she had a fever and I stayed up counting her breaths, the day her father left, and I promised her things would be okay. Even though I wasn't sure, I realized then that this wasn't about one sentence. This was about years of quiet entitlement I had ignored because love made excuses easy. When I came back home that evening, she wasn't there. I felt relief, followed by guilt for feeling relieved. I sat down again at the table, opened the laptop again. This time, I didn't close it. I reviewed every detail slowly. The scheduled payments, the agreements, the automatic transfers that required only my confirmation to continue. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I thought about the kind of gift she had asked for, and I thought about the kind of lesson she had never learned. I canceled the funding, not dramatically, not angrily, methodically. Each click felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. Not revenge, not punishment, boundaries. When I was done, I sat back and felt something unexpected. Peace. She found out 3 days later. She stormed into the house, face flushed, phone in hand. "What did you do?" she demanded. I didn't stand up. "I changed the arrangements," I said. "You ruined everything." She shouted. "Do you know what this means for me?" I looked at her carefully, really looked at her, and realized she had no idea what her words had meant to me. "I do," I said. "And now you do too." She stared at me, breathing hard, waiting for me to take it back. I didn't. That was the moment something irreversible happened between us, not because I canceled the funding, but because for the first time in her life, I didn't rescue her from the consequences of her own words. I've always been someone who planned ahead. My life, in many ways, has been defined by preparation, by foresight, by the belief that if I could control what I could protect the people I love from the unexpected. When my daughter was born, I poured myself into her entirely. I took extra jobs, skipped vacations, and spent long nights researching everything: schools, tutors, extracurriculars, anything that could give her opportunities I never had. My own desires were always secondary, and I never thought twice about that. Her father wasn't in the picture much. He left before she even turned 5, and while I never spoke badly about him, the absence meant that I had to become everything for her: mother and father, protector and provider, cheerleader and disciplinarian. I juggled the long hours at work with bedtime stories, science projects, and birthday surprises. There were nights when my body ached from exhaustion, but seeing her sleep peacefully, or watching her light up over a small victory, made it all feel worth it. I had always believed that love meant sacrifice. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't always appreciated. But I didn't mind. I worked tirelessly to ensure she had what she needed. I managed the finances carefully, set up accounts for school fees, extracurriculars, even a small trust fund I hoped would help her when she grew older. Every transaction, every dollar, was a promise I made to her, though at the time, I thought it was enough to be silent, to support her quietly, without requiring thanks or acknowledgement. We had routines, strict but familiar. Mornings began with breakfast, packed lunches, and reminders to get to school on time. I juggled work and errands while she navigated her own life, friends, homework, hobbies. Evenings were a mix of checking on assignments, preparing meals, and brief, meaningful conversations. We weren't perfect, but I thought we were close. I thought I knew her. I thought my sacrifices and careful planning had built a bridge between us. But over the years, I began to notice small changes. She grew more independent naturally, as children do, but her demeanor shifted. She became more assertive, sometimes blunt, occasionally dismissive. I would hear her self-talk back, or make comments that stung more than they should have. I chalked it up to teenage rebellion, to normal growing pains, or to stress at school. I told myself that these were temporary, and that love meant patience. Still, I tried to guide her, quietly and consistently. I emphasized the importance of responsibility, of gratitude, of understanding consequences. I talked to her about managing money, respecting family, and taking care of herself. I shared stories of my own struggles and sacrifices, hoping she would learn without the need for harsh lessons. Most of the time, she listened. Sometimes she ignored me. Other times, she seemed irritated. But I believed, deep down, that the foundation was strong. I made it a point to be involved in her schooling. Parent-teacher meetings, school events, fundraisers. I was there for everything I could be, often at the cost of my own comfort and personal time. I saved meticulously to ensure she never lacked basic opportunities: music lessons, art classes, sports equipment. Money wasn't just money, it was a promise, a safeguard, a tangible expression of my commitment to her growth. And yet, as she got older, I noticed that she began to take things for granted. Small requests became demands. Complaints, once infrequent, were now regular. I would hear things like, "You're always in the way," or "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" I tried to remind myself that it was part of growing up, that I had done my best to nurture her independence. Still, a quiet anxiety began to grow inside me, a sense that my efforts were no longer appreciated in the way I imagined they would be. There were also moments of sharp contrast, moments when she would still surprise me with kindness or thoughtfulness. A note left on the counter, a cup of tea when I was tired, a quiet thank you after a small gesture. Those moments reminded me of why I had worked so hard, why I had sacrificed so much. They were brief, but they carried immense emotional weight, reinforcing my commitment. Even when the tension between us grew. At home, the atmosphere was a careful balance. I tried not to impose too much, to allow her space, while maintaining structure and boundaries. The house was organized. Bills were paid on time, schedules were clear. I often thought that creating stability was the best gift I could give her, even more than the financial support. But the tension was building slowly, subtly. There was a distance forming that I couldn't quite pinpoint. She was growing into her own person, yes, but there was also a quiet disregard forming, a sense of entitlement that I had not anticipated. I remember one evening vividly. I had cooked her favorite meal, a small comfort in an otherwise busy week. I set the table carefully, hoping for a moment of connection. She came in, glanced at the food, and muttered, "I'll just grab something later," before walking past me. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was indifference. And that indifference struck deeper than any argument ever could. I realized then that while I had been building, planning, and sacrificing, she had been growing in a world that no longer felt tethered to the effort I had poured into it. Even with these signs, I continued to provide. Money, guidance, structure all remained in place, because that's what love had always meant to me. I didn't question my decisions. I didn't hesitate. I simply acted, believing that my presence and my support were inherently valued. I never expected the possibility that the very care I provided could be met with such coldness, such calculated disregard. Every day, I tried to reconcile to realities: the child I had nurtured, the daughter I had raised with love, and the increasingly sharp, demanding, and ungrateful person she was becoming. I walked a tightrope between protecting her, giving her independence, and preparing her for the lessons that life would inevitably teach. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and often invisible work, but I thought it was worth it. I thought love was always worth it. Yet, deep inside, a small voice whispered warnings I refused to acknowledge. The entitlement, the indifference, the subtle disrespect. It was a signal, a foreshadowing. I didn't know how to interpret it fully. I didn't realize it would escalate to the point where she would openly articulate the desire for my absence, to see me gone. At the time, I simply pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the routines, the care, the love I continued to provide. Those routines, my careful planning, and my relentless work to find the rhythm of our household. I believed that structure and provision were the foundations of love, yet I was beginning to see that they were only one part of the equation. Emotional reciprocity, gratitude, and mutual respect were equally important, and without them, even the most meticulous care could be met with disdain. Through all of this, I never stopped hoping. I held on to the belief that my daughter would recognize, eventually, the sacrifices made on her behalf. I believed that she would understand the love woven into each act of provision, each careful payment, each lesson imparted. And yet, the tension was building, an invisible pressure mounting beneath the surface, awaiting a catalyst. The catalyst arrived, quietly, but with the force of inevitability. The words she spoke, the words that would change everything, didn't emerge from anger, not directly. They came from accumulated entitlement, from frustration, from years of taking care for granted. But I had no way of anticipating the immediacy and the brutality of their impact. By the time she uttered, "The best gift would be if you just died," the groundwork had already been laid. Years of daily life, of sacrifice, of unnoticed work, of subtle emotional neglect on her part, culminated in that one devastating sentence. And in that moment, I realized that understanding our past, the routines, the sacrifices, The dynamics was necessary not just to process what had happened, but to decide how I would respond. I sat there after she left, replaying every detail, every memory, every act of care I had provided. The long nights, the careful budgeting, the meals prepared, the guidance offered, all of it crystallized into a clear understanding. Love without boundaries can be taken for granted. Kindness without consequence can be exploited. And for the first time, I began to see that sometimes the quietest, most effective lessons are delivered not through confrontation, but through action and restraint. After I canceled the funding, the atmosphere in the house shifted immediately. It wasn't dramatic, at least not at first. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a subtle tension that clung to every corner, like dust in a sunbeam. She walked around the house with a kind of wary suspicion, testing boundaries, trying to understand the limits of my response. I noticed how carefully she measured her words, how she paused before speaking, how she seemed to be evaluating the consequences of every action. At first, I expected anger. I expected confrontation. But what came instead was something more complex: manipulation. She began to speak in calculated tones, half complaints, half apologies, trying to pull at my empathy while testing whether I would relent. "I didn't mean it like that," she said repeatedly. "You know I love you. You're being dramatic." Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable, but the undertone was deliberate, an attempt to make me question myself. I realized painfully that she had learned how to navigate me, how to use guilt and charm as tools to regain control. I didn't respond the way she wanted. I stayed calm, steady, and silent when appropriate. I let her words hang in the air, unacknowledged, in the way she hoped. I refused to engage in the tug-of-war she had initiated. The silence, more than any argument, unsettled her. She didn't know how to read it because it didn't fit the patterns she had learned from years of predictable responses. My calm, deliberate restraint became a mirror, reflecting back the consequences of her actions in a way words never could. Over the next few weeks, a subtle power struggle emerged. She tried to reassert influence over household routines, her tone increasingly sharp when she felt I was encroaching on what she considered her domain. I noticed small acts designed to provoke me: leaving dishes unwashed, misplacing important documents, using my things without permission. Each incident was carefully observed, cataloged mentally, and responded to with measured restraint. I didn't lecture. I didn't punish. I simply allowed the consequences of her actions to unfold naturally. The emotional pressure was exhausting. Every interaction became a test, sometimes of patience, sometimes of insight, always of control. I had to constantly evaluate how to respond in ways that reinforced boundaries without escalating tension unnecessarily. Her attempts to manipulate, to cajole, to guilt me became increasingly sophisticated. She would flash a fleeting smile after a pointed comment, trying to soften the impact, to gauge whether I would back down. Each time, I resisted. I had to maintain control not only over the situation, but over my own reactions. At home, the balance shifted further. The house felt quieter in some ways, heavier in others. I observed her, noting the moments of frustration that passed quickly, the attempts to regain her former comfort and access to resources. She didn't lash out in obvious ways anymore. Instead, she tested boundaries with subtlety. She would ask questions about finances, about plans, about decisions, in ways designed to see if I would revert. But my consistency remained unbroken. I answered factually, without indulgence, without apology. The internal conflict within me grew stronger. I wanted to soften the edges, to restore harmony, to explain myself fully so she wouldn't feel abandoned. But I also understood that yielding would undo everything I had set into motion: the lesson she needed, the boundary she had crossed, the awareness she had to gain. The tension was necessary. It was uncomfortable. It was a test, not just for her, but for me as well. Could I maintain firmness without cruelty? Could I teach consequences without destroying trust? I noticed how she began to act differently around friends and at school. The confidence she displayed in private interactions faltered when she realized her control over the household had waned. Subtle signs of frustration emerged: sharp words with peers, impatience in conversations, small emotional outbursts. And I saw it as confirmation that the foundation of entitlement I had inadvertently allowed was being challenged, and that the lessons were starting to sink in. Even if slowly, there were moments when she attempted to provoke me directly. One evening, she made a pointed comment about how I didn't understand her life and implied that my control was suffocating. I listened carefully, letting the words pass without engagement. I noticed the subtle shift in her tone when I remained calm: confusion, then frustration, then finally resignation. The realization that my response wasn't predictable or negotiable was unsettling for her. The power balance, for the first time, was not in her hands. It wasn't easy. Each day required conscious effort. I had to manage my own emotions constantly: anger, disappointment, lingering hurt, so that they didn't give her leverage. I reminded myself that this wasn't about punishment in the traditional sense. It was about restoring equilibrium, teaching accountability, and allowing her to confront the reality of her words. The quiet, deliberate tension became a classroom, and the lesson was unfolding in real time. I also became more strategic in my interactions. I gave her opportunities to demonstrate responsibility, to regain trust, to show understanding, but these were met with clear expectations. I observed not just her actions, but her intentions, noting where entitlement and manipulation surfaced. I didn't lecture. I didn't threaten. I let natural consequences play out, reinforcing the lesson that words and actions have weight. The emotional landscape of our home shifted gradually. There were bursts of frustration from her, attempts to regain influence, and moments of tension so thick they seemed almost visible. But there were also quiet observations, subtle reflections, and small steps towards self-awareness. She began to test not just the boundaries of her environment, but the limits of my patience and control, and in doing so, revealed the gaps in her own understanding of consequences. Through all of this, I learned something about myself. Maintaining control wasn't about being strict or harsh. It was about clarity, consistency, and emotional steadiness. It was about teaching through presence, through consequence, through careful observation. The struggle was not merely between parent and child, but between impulse and restraint, emotion and reason. The internal conflict she created mirrored my own: the desire to fix, to soften, to comfort versus the need to teach, to challenge, to establish consequences. I realized that true care sometimes required withholding, sometimes required letting discomfort settle, and sometimes required enduring resistance to ensure growth. This tension, though exhausting, was necessary. It was shaping both of us. I noticed subtle changes in her behavior over time. Her defiance became less pointed, her tone less biting. She began to pause before speaking, to consider the weight of her words. I observed how she would hesitate at moments when she previously would have demanded. And I knew that the lesson, the power of boundaries and consequences, was taking root. The process was slow, deliberate, and emotionally draining. There were moments when frustration threatened to break my composure, but I stayed steadfast. Each small act of calm, measured response reinforced the new dynamic. She began to recognize, without explicit teaching, that her words and actions carried consequences. In those weeks, I realized that this period of tension wasn't punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching responsibility, accountability, and self-reflection. It was about demonstrating that actions, especially cruel, dismissive, or ungrateful ones, cannot exist without consequence. And it was about reclaiming my own sense of authority and dignity in a relationship that had been increasingly tested. By the end of the third week, I could feel the shift. The emotional tension remained, but it had changed shape. It was no longer purely resistance or testing. It was awareness, reflection, and the first hints of understanding. The dynamic had altered, subtly but irrevocably. Control was no longer in her hands alone. She had begun to recognize the limits, the boundaries, and the responsibilities she had long ignored. And in that shift, I felt the first glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not hope that she would immediately change, but hope that she could. Hope that the lessons of words and consequences, of entitlement and restraint, were sinking in. And with that hope came a renewed sense of calm authority. The understanding that patience, clarity, and measured action could transform even the most resistant relationships over time. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, but the shift was undeniable. After weeks of tension, silence, and subtle power struggles, something finally broke the pattern. I was in the living room one afternoon, sorting through bills and correspondence, when I noticed an envelope tucked behind the magazine rack. It wasn't the first time I had found forgotten papers, but something about this one felt different. I pulled it out, and my eyes immediately caught the handwriting hers. Inside was a carefully written letter. The words were deliberate, measured, even apologetic. But beneath the polite surface, there was honesty. She had never spoken aloud. She admitted her frustration, her feelings of being controlled, and the resentment she had been harboring. More importantly, she admitted she had never fully understood the weight of my sacrifices. She confessed that the words she had spoken, words that had cut deeper than I could have imagined, were born out of confusion, misunderstanding, and in part, guilt for not appreciating the life I had built for her. Reading the letter, I felt a rush of emotions I hadn't expected: relief, sadness, empathy, and a quiet satisfaction. The revelation wasn't just that she had written it, it was that she had taken responsibility for her words, for her attitude, and for the ways she had tested boundaries. The power dynamic that had dominated our home for so long was shifting, not through confrontation or punishment, but through acknowledgement and self-awareness. I called her into the room. She appeared cautious, unsure of what I had discovered. Her posture was tentative, her eyes flicking between me and the floor. I held the letter in my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed a small, measured smile. "I read your letter," I said quietly. "Thank you for being honest with me." It took courage. Her reaction was immediate and complex. Relief, fear, shame all passed across her face in a matter of seconds. She sat down across from me, hands clasped tightly in her lap, and for the first time, she seemed smaller, more vulnerable, and more human than the entitled, demanding version I had been navigating for weeks. I didn't know how to say it," she admitted. "I didn't know how to express myself without being hurtful. I thought if I pushed you away, things would be easier for me." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the depth of her realization. I nodded. "I understand. But you also need to understand that words have weight. And sometimes love requires boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable." We spent the next several hours talking, not arguing, not trying to assign blame, just talking honestly, quietly, carefully. She spoke about the frustration of growing up, of feeling unheard, of resenting the structure I had imposed. I shared my perspective, explaining the effort, the sacrifices, and the hope that she would one day appreciate the work that had gone into building a foundation for her life. The conversation revealed truths I hadn't fully seen before. She had grown in ways I hadn't noticed, and I had underestimated the ways my actions, though intended to protect, could feel suffocating or controlling. At the same time, she now understood, in a way she hadn't before, the depth of my commitment and the lengths I had gone to ensure her security and success. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic apologies shouted across the room. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, and deeply emotional. We faced each other across the table, acknowledging the past, admitting faults, and understanding each other more clearly than we had in years. The turning point came later that week when she made her first tangible gesture of responsibility. She returned a sum of money she had borrowed without asking, apologized for the casual entitlement in her tone, and asked for guidance in planning her finances responsibly. This small act was more powerful than any lecture or argument could have been. It demonstrated awareness, accountability, and a willingness to accept guidance without resentment. I realized then that the balance of power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through clarity and honesty. The quiet authority I had maintained, the patience, the consistency, and the refusal to yield to manipulation, all of it had culminated in a moment of understanding. She could see her actions from a new perspective, and I could finally see her willingness to grow. Over the following days, the change became more evident. She began to communicate more thoughtfully, to consider consequences before acting, and to express gratitude in ways she had previously ignored. There were still moments of tension, of testing boundaries, but the foundation had shifted. She now recognized that respect, responsibility, and awareness were part of our relationship, and I could maintain calm authority without fear of rebellion undermining it. I also discovered a deeper truth about myself. The process of maintaining boundaries, enforcing consequences, and resisting manipulation had taught me patience, emotional discipline, and the importance of consistency. I had learned that true authority comes not from control, but from calm, deliberate action combined with empathy and understanding. The letter, the conversation, And the small acts of responsibility that followed were not just turning points for her, they were turning points for me. I realized that raising a child into adulthood is not only about provision, but about shaping character, teaching, accountability, and guiding with patience, even when it is most challenging. By the end of that week, the house felt lighter. There was no grand celebration, no dramatic resolution. There was only the quiet, profound sense that the relationship had been realigned. That understanding had replaced entitlement, and that trust could now be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The revelation had done its work not by force, not by confrontation, but by bringing the hidden truth into the open, creating a space for responsibility, reflection, and genuine connection. It was the moment when I understood fully that lessons learned quietly, through reflection and consequence, are often the most lasting. And in that quiet, deliberate turning point, the path forward became clear. Trust could be restored, boundaries respected, and love maintained, not through blind indulgence, but through careful guidance, patience, and earned understanding. In the days and weeks that followed, our home began to feel lighter, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The tension that had hung between us for so long gradually loosened its grip. She no longer spoke with that sharp edge, no longer measured every word to see if it would provoke a reaction. The air was calmer, conversations slower, more thoughtful, more deliberate. And in that quiet, I felt the weight of responsibility I had carried finally begin to ease. She began taking small steps that reflected a change in awareness. She returned borrowed items without being asked, double-checked details before making requests, and even asked for guidance when she was unsure of how to handle her finances or responsibilities. These gestures were not dramatic, and they weren't accompanied by declarations of gratitude, but each one carried immense emotional significance. Every small act of responsibility was a sign that the lessons had taken hold. I noticed her attitude toward me also change. She was still young, still learning, still discovering the limits of her independence. But there was a quiet respect in her tone and a recognition of boundaries she had previously ignored. She no longer assumed entitlement, nor did she attempt to manipulate or test me. There was a subtle humility in her presence, and with it, a slow rebuilding of trust between us. For my part, I allowed myself a quiet pride, tempered by patience. I didn't indulge in triumph. I didn't gloat or punish further. I simply observed, guided, and reinforced boundaries as needed. The satisfaction came not from power or authority, but from seeing her grow into a more conscious, responsible, and self-aware individual. The gift I had withheld the funding. The unconditional convenience had become a tool for teaching accountability rather than punishment. And its impact was evident in her transformation. There were still occasional moments of friction, of old habits resurfacing, but these were met with calm, measured responses rather than anger or frustration. I explained consequences, offered guidance, and allowed her to experience the natural outcomes of her choices. The environment had shifted from one of conflict to one of learning, from tension to understanding. Every interaction became an opportunity to reinforce responsibility without creating resentment. I also reflected on my own growth. The experience had tested my patience, my empathy, and my ability to maintain calm in the face of direct disrespect. It had reminded me that quiet, deliberate action often has more impact than words or dramatic gestures. I had learned that enforcing boundaries and teaching responsibility does not require force or anger, but clarity, consistency, and emotional steadiness. The process had strengthened my sense of self and my ability to navigate complex emotional dynamics without losing control or compassion. In observing her evolution, I realized that true justice is rarely loud or dramatic. It is quiet, deliberate, and emotionally earned. It is the result of actions taken with integrity, patience, and foresight. By choosing not to give her what she demanded, by maintaining clear boundaries, and by allowing her to face the consequences of her words, I had created an environment where growth, reflection, and accountability were possible. Over time, our relationship began to resemble something closer to mutual respect. I didn't rescue her from her mistakes or shield her from consequences unnecessarily. She, in turn, began to demonstrate awareness, thoughtfulness, and consideration. The distance that had grown between us shrank gradually, replaced by cautious trust and an emerging understanding of responsibility. I noticed changes in her daily behavior as well. She started managing her tasks independently, asking for advice rather than demanding solutions, and demonstrating awareness of the effort behind what had once been provided automatically. Each act of responsibility reinforced the lesson that her words and choices had real consequences and that trust is maintained through honesty, accountability, and care. The peace that settled into our household was quiet but profound. There was no celebration, no dramatic acknowledgement. The transformation was subtle, observed in small gestures, careful words, and the steady rebuilding of trust. This quiet justice, this emotional realignment, felt more powerful than any moment of confrontation could have been. It was earned, and it was lasting. I also realized that love, when paired with boundaries and patience, could be both firm and gentle. By choosing not to indulge her entitlement, by responding calmly and consistently, I had created a space for her to grow, reflect, and understand the impact of her words. The lessons she learned were internalized rather than imposed, and that gave them enduring power. In the weeks that followed, our household returned to a sense of balance. Conversations flowed with more care, interactions were less charged with hidden tension, and the small acts of accountability continued to reinforce the new dynamic. I observed her with a quiet satisfaction, not because I had one, but because she was learning, growing, and developing a deeper understanding of responsibility, empathy, and respect. The funding I had withheld remained a tool of accountability, not punishment. I continued to provide support where necessary, but always with conditions, expectations, and clarity. She responded with growing maturity, demonstrating that she had absorbed the lesson. And in this careful, deliberate process, I found both peace and validation. Ultimately, the incident, the harsh words, the challenge, the withdrawal of support had led to a transformation that was calm, earned, and enduring. It had tested our relationship, pushed boundaries, and forced reflection, but it had also created space for growth, understanding, and mutual respect. The quiet justice of accountability had worked. Looking back, I understood something important. True lessons, true change, and true justice do not require drama or anger. They require patience, clarity, and emotional consistency. They demand that consequences are allowed to unfold naturally, and that guidance is offered without indulgence. And they show in quiet yet undeniable ways the power of responsibility, honesty, and reflection in shaping character and relationships. In the end, the balance between parent and child was restored not through force, not through conflict, but through the deliberate, patient enforcement of boundaries and the careful cultivation of awareness. She had learned, and I had maintained my integrity. And in that quiet, unspoken alignment, the deepest form of justice had been realized. Life continued, and our relationship settled into a rhythm of cautious trust, mutual awareness, and earned respect. The words she had spoken would not be forgotten, but neither would the lesson she had learned or the understanding she had gained. The house was calm. Our connection, though tested, was intact. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet satisfaction of having done what was necessary, not in anger, not in revenge, but in quiet, deliberate love.